Welcome to the Modern Mystic podcast, where we help you make your spirituality an actuality and find more meaning, mindfulness, and magic in your day-to-day life. I am your host, Kilkenny, who is an elite coach, yoga and meditation professor, psychic medium, and astrologer, and have been training and spiritually mentoring thousands of people over the past 20 years. Today, I am thrilled and deeply excited to be welcoming Ashley Turner. She is a licensed psychologist, yoga meditation expert, priestess, psychedelic assisted and integration therapist, and seven-figure wellness entrepreneur. And I'm hoping to speak to the Mod Pod all about how psychology and spirituality are not antithetical, nor are anxiety and depression, what the priestess path actually is, how we can add more spirituality into our parenting, our caregiving, and to our businesses. So without further ado, Ashley, welcome to the Modern Mystic podcast.
Thank you so much. So good to be back. Thank you for having me.
Well, it was such a blessing because when I started this podcast and it was literally an infant, you came on, and it's been so long, and you are always so inspiring to me because you are constantly doing truly that deep, deep inner work. And I always feel that osmotically whenever I hear you speak and when I see what your most recent iteration of presence and being and offering in the way of your teaching and your business into this world. And so I can't wait to hear in this moment in time, what does it mean to you to be a modern mystic 3-ish years later from when I last spoke with you?
Such a great question. I love this question. And I think I've been really forced, I would say, to tune into it on an even deeper level. I have a young daughter. She's 3.5. And I just recently went through a lot of big changes. We moved, we renovated a house, and then a lot of big internal shifts hitting perimenopause as well, which coincided with becoming a new mother and was really challenging physically, mentally, emotionally, a lot to do with the hormone imbalance, which we can talk more about. But I've really kind of been brought to my knees in the last couple of years. It's been I would say it's been the most difficult phase of my career, actually. And I had to double down on all of these practices that I know work. And so for me, when I think of it in a nutshell, what is a modern mystic? It's that we frame all of life's challenges through the lens of soul lessons. So instead of getting caught up in, the melodrama or the content or, the thing, the problem, the obstacle, and taking it personally and then going down that rabbit hole, we can take a step back and say, okay, I am spirit having a human experience. What is the lesson that I'm here to learn? And also to know that I will be okay. We are spirits. We are supported by spirit. We're supported by infinite forces all around us. And how can I tap into those forces to rise and meet the challenge that's in front of me? And so it's a reframing. It's really I think of it like we're playing a very different game. It's playing a very different game. It's playing the real game, really the only game in town, which is how do we wake up? How do we evolve our consciousness? How do we become a little bit more skillful in our lives? And I have a long way to go.
Well, there are so many things that I deeply appreciate about what you spoke of, and the crux of it and quintessential aspect that I think is so powerful is you look at someone like you, who's a very well-known, you could say, quote unquote, famous spiritual / yogic, all the things, leader, and in various communities and spectrums across the board. And a lot of people would look to you as this being as, oh, like this person is so successful, 7-figure entrepreneur, spiritualpreneur, and has all the things lined up, the daughter, it's on the outside. And like you said, it's that aphorism from the yogic tradition, how the sword's edge gets sharper as you go down the path. And that's been my experience too, as like a committed practitioner since I was 5. Like, there are moments and times of life, of course, that are so expansive, and you feel that absolute exponential blessing of the practices. But then naturally, there's the ebb and flow of life. There's the sun, rising, and then the sun setting. There's the out breath and in breath. And we all have these times where then, as you mentioned, we get forced back into that dark night of the soul. And then it's like, okay, do you do the practices? And as you said, double down on them or not? And so thank you for sharing so authentically. And I'm curious for you right now in space and time, what are those practices that you're doubling down on?
Hmm. Well, I think the first thing is I finally, ironically, being a yoga and meditation teacher for 24 years, I finally have started meditating every day. It's the actual first thing I'm doing every morning. And I can never say that I did that before, where I actually got up and the first thing I did was meditate. And I just have had to cultivate my own connection with my intuition, with my inner voice. I feel like the outer world is just getting so noisy between politics and social media and the technology, the momentum of technology. And then, of course, having a young child and everything that comes with that. I really had to cultivate my inner voice and connect with spirit first. In the priestess tradition, I used to run a priestess mystery school, and we talk about feeding spirit first. And so in the yoga tradition, it's in the yamas and niyamas, it's Ishvara Pranidan, of devoting everything to spirit first. And so when I orient my day to spirit and say, okay, I give this over, like, please work through me, please open me up, please let me see more clearly, just like we did right before we did this podcast, starting into our own is orienting to spirit first. And number two, I would say, is really attuning to my body in a whole other level than I have in the past. I've been really blessed. I've been very healthy my whole life, but perimenopause really has kicked my ass. And I think it was more challenging because I had my child really late in life, my mid 40s. And so by the time, I breastfed her for 2 years. And when I stopped breastfeeding, my hormones just were so out of whack. She was also an IVF baby. So we were doing hormones already before before I was pregnant. And so then coming out of the breastfeeding journey, I went straight into perimenopause and I didn't even realize it. And so I was experiencing a significant amount of depression, anxiety, brain fog, overwhelm, lack of agency, lack of confidence, things that I'd never really experienced in my life, luckily. And I actually didn't recognize what was going on for quite some time. And then I was
Mhm.
finally like, whoa, this is actually really connected to my hormones. And so because of that, I've been on a big journey really only in the last 9 months of tending to my hormones, which means being much more careful about my diet, exercise, weight training, cardio, along with yoga. And it's really absolutely become a non negotiable. And that's the blessing of any physical challenge. And I would actually say psychological challenge, because I don't differentiate between the two. I think that a lot of people are probably struggling mentally, emotionally, like I was, and it actually has a physical root, and vice versa. But the mind and the body are not separate. So I've had to double down on the physical practices and also slow down. So
That
the
was
third
one of
thing,
my questions. Excuse me for interrupting, but exactly, like, let's dive into this perimenopause, menopausal phase, because I have so many friends who have gone through menopause or are perimenopausal, like you said, and didn't know it. And, it's such a journey. And so many people I know now say, oh, when I was in my early 30s, I think I was starting and I didn't even realize. And if
yeah,
you are in a position like you or I, who are established in these patriarchal spiritual systems, no
yeah,
one's ever talking about these things. Like I grew up in an ashram, and it was this Shiva male oriented ashram. And
hmm,
no one's talking about these things, even with, female swamis. It's just these things, like in our Western culture, it's not really a shock because this is something that in the in the diatribe and in the consciousness and conversation collectively, we're only just starting to really talk about in
Yeah.
some circles, right? So
Yeah.
in spiritual circles, like when is this ever talked about? And like you're saying, talk us through for you, because in some ways you're really, I see, on the precipice of this conversation and help pushing it forward. You know,
Yeah.
you talked about doubling down, but that doesn't necessarily mean speeding up. So let's talk about that relationship, how you view that relationship spiritually, psychologically, and physically, as it's tied into both of those
Yeah.
arenas.
I'm so glad you asked this question. I think I have been doing a, a lot of inner work, very deep inner work. And it really has been a dark night of the soul for me. It's been extremely intense. I mean, in many ways, things are going great. My daughter could not be more perfect and healthy and thriving. I'm in a great relationship, although it's really been challenged the last couple of years. And actually, the statistics are that a lot of relationships that break up when a woman is very big
Really?
changes
What are
that
those
are,
statistics? Because I haven't
I
heard them,
think
but it makes sense to
saw,
me based on
I,
a lot of people I
I
know.
think I just saw a statistic that was like 60%. I hope I'm not getting this wrong. But I think it was like 60% or more of marriages break up because the woman initiates it. And
Mm-hmm.
I saw somewhere else that a physician was saying that, the majority that she sees, the majority of divorces that are happening when the woman's going through menopause. And I think
Interesting.
it's kind of where we've been in our relationship. It's been really challenging. And a lot of it has been due to my own experience, again, dealing with pretty major depression and anxiety, which was very foreign to me. Um, and again, went undiagnosed, I would say. I mean, I have the capability and the tools. I was kind of staying right, kind of on top of it, but like, again, not realizing that's actually even what was going on.
Well,
And
and you're
then,
a trained psychotherapist, right? So I just want to
I know.
honor and validate for you and anyone listening. Like, if you're going through a lot of things
Yeah.
that Ashley is detailing, and she's a trained psychologist,
Yeah.
right? That's how elusive, subtle, nuanced
Yeah.
they can be. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I can't really speak about it enough. I'm basically getting ready to start my own podcast because I'm just like, we need to talk about this more because there is a lot of conversation out there about hormonal health and balancing the hormones physiologically. But what I'm not hearing so much of is the psychological journey and the depth psychological journey of a woman going through menopause because there's a huge shift in identity, in desire, not just sexual desire, but desire in the world. Like my ambition has really waned, and or at least what I was ambitious for in the past, sort of ego driven ambition, and I just have a whole other motivation that's coming online, and it feels so good and such a release, but it's challenging because I'm still comparing myself to maybe who I was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And a really important piece of this conversation is that, as you mentioned, we are living in a culture, if you're living in the West, and really the majority of the world in modern society is living in cultures that are based on these patriarchal and white supremacist cultural values and norms, which are urgency. These are just a few of them, but urgency, meaning more is better, faster is best, individualism, um, that we have to get ours, we have to go and claim ours, really valuing the mental body and what's tangible and measurable instead of the whole other half of life in the universe that is the feminine, that is mercurial and intangible, energetics, emotions, all of these different aspects that are so rich and bring so much meaning to our experience. And we're living in these cultural norms that are also, with this advent of technology and now social media and technology in our hands with our phones, pushing us to a very unrealistic pace, and the emphasis on consumption and capitalism. And so, it's hard to rail against such deep conditioning. and that our whole culture is set up on these systems. So whether you're talking about the educational system, the medical system, our capitalistic economy, um, everything is conditioning us to work in this one way. And as women in particular, that's not how we're wired. We're wired relationally, we're wired in a more egalitarian way. And so to be a disruptor, it takes a lot of self actualization, a lot of self possession to really stand on your own and say, you know what, I don't have to do that. I'm not going to do it that way. So, one example, just to bring it home for people, in my business, I've gone through a huge shift in the last 2 years, and I was running a couple different online programs, big 6-month teacher training program, year-long priestess program. Not to say that I'll never do those again, but I've really felt the urge to downshift and work much more closely with smaller groups of people. And yet, if you're in an online business, any kind of business really, but especially as an entrepreneur, there is this model that we've been sold about, selling online courses and launching and creating content. And so one example is this formula that we need to create all this content to nurture, an audience and then get them to buy. Well, I just did not have the capacity to be creating content. I was like, fuck that. I'm not a machine. I can't be over here just pumping out content, staying inspired, coming up with new stuff when I have a young child, a baby. I want to just, relish in that phase of motherhood, new home. And I'm going through perimenopause and I'm really struggling. And
On top
so
of yeah.
I had a really hard time beating myself up about not keeping up with all these other people that I'm seeing online. And half of them don't have children, or are not going through menopause. I mean, we can't, you can never compare apples and oranges. But the bigger problem is that we're being sold this model that really creates harm in a lot of ways and is unsustainable. So we just need to question our questions and think a little more critically and be willing to lean into those edges and be a disruptor. And if we're going to change the norm, we have to change it from the inside out, and we have to change it for
Yes.
ourselves first.
Oh, so many rich and completely mind-blowing things you spoke of. And I just want to celebrate and highlight. I know even for myself, like with my own transformation of work from being a brick and mortar, hugely successful yoga studio, mindfulness studio owner, to going online. And, I have so many people who've asked me to do a course. And like you, I've done trainings for so long and it only makes sense. I have a huge pool of people who write me consistently, like, can you do some kind of training, even though my work has shifted so much. And the same thing, like I'm now just doing one-on-one readings and coaching, and so many people, and I've even like had marketing people come to me, and like you, I'm not saying I'll never do a course. I feel that in me someday, but like I'm waiting instead of just rushing it. And there's so many things I could scale, like you're saying, and getting bigger and getting taller and getting more. But right now I'm doing like psychic readings, going so deep in, and it's shocking to me. Like I still am shocked at the work I'm doing, but I'm doing it because, like you, every day, and it's non-negotiable for me forever, I sit and I meditate. And I think that is the absolute core. And my listeners will, the ones who hear me all the time will just be like, oh, there she goes again. But it's true. I was a guest on Deborah Silverman's podcast recently, and she was talking the same thing, how that is the number one thing that she feels is hard for most people. And I do too. I'm a yoga professor at university. All the students, I just say, okay, the assignment's 1 to 3 minutes meditation every day. And it's so hard for them, but when they do it, their life starts to change. And then they start to, prolong that 1 to 3 minutes to 3 to 5 minutes. And it's just like you said, that connection to source and the highest self. And I like to think of it wider self, which also is a more feminine paradigm, to think like how, not only how up and down you can make yourself tall, like your spine and connecting, right? Like you think of plugging into source above you, but really how wide can you make yourself, so that you're really opening up and receiving your own dharma, your own purpose, and what you really are here to do in a way that you will then thrive. Because when we're thriving, then people around us thrive even more. So I love what you're speaking about and questioning the questions, because so much of what we are doing in our life, and I find this all the time with my coaching clients, are running our life from a program of unconscious beliefs that actually aren't even ours, right? So it's just really profound what you're speaking of. What are other concrete things? We got the meditation. You
Mhm.
talked about embodiment. You did mention slowing down. I'm curious about that, like physically slowing down and yet doing more of different physical activities. Can that be any physical activity in your mind? So let's talk and give people like really concrete things that they can do, understanding that we are trying to be patriarchal and
Yeah, I
spiritual
mean,
disruptors.
for me, physically, yoga is also a non-negotiable. I wouldn't say I do yoga every single day. I mean, I'm living yoga. Yoga is not just the asana, but the asana practice, I think, a couple times a week at least. I also realized that I needed to get back, kind of what you were saying with your sessions. I needed to get back to teachings live, people in the studio. So I went back to my local yoga studio, and we just moved to the east side of LA. And one of my students, luckily, is managing this awesome studio in the neighborhood. And so I was like, hey, she was like, would you ever want to come teach? And I was like, I was going to ask you. I just want one class a week. I just want to come in and teach. And because for me, when I teach, I'm channeling and I'm really in the yoga, I'm in the field of yoga. And so teaching for me really activates that frequency in me, or that connection with source. So I love teaching. But doing yoga, for me, physical activity, and I think getting out in nature is really, really important, because if you look, I'm thinking, from as a mental health professional, as a psychotherapist, what's happening for us sociologically right now is very scary. And our culture is moving more and more online. Again, faster and faster pace. And people are feeling more isolated than ever, even though we're living in this sort of more hyper connected world. And so there's a few pieces that are really important for us functionally. And essentially it's the root chakra, of staying really grounded. But what does the root chakra represent? Which is our foundation, of course. And it's our foundation, again, not just physically, but psychologically. We want to always think about those are two sides of the same coin. So physically, it represents, a sense of belonging, a sense of safety and security, number one, but also a sense of belonging to a tribe, belonging to a family where you know that you're not alone. And if something happens to you out in the wild, other people are there to protect you. You're going to be held. Psychologically, we need to create that same kind of belonging. Many people now have moved, it's the norm in this modern world. Many people move away from their family of origin. They're living in cities, and we have to recreate those tribal communities. We also got very disconnected from that, of course, with COVID and the pandemic, and isolation and depression, really went through the roof. And so, whatever the ways are that you feel a sense of belonging, so I would start with number one, connecting to the earth, connecting to your mother earth, connecting to nature itself, whatever way feels good for you. I at least try to get out to the park every day with my daughter and just be outside in nature with her and have her connecting to nature. But also, at least once a week, going on some bigger adventure, on a hike, or to the beach, or something that's really immersing us in nature. That shift in our physiological state and our energetic body is so important for us to get away from the screens, to get away from just work. And remember, we're animals, we're on this planet, and nature is an immediate reminder of what's important in life. And there are so many lessons, of course, in just observing nature. So it sounds so simplistic, but it's really a commitment to make. The second thing I would say, physical activity, I love, I think whatever physical activity inspires you and works for you is what you want to do, because hopefully you'll be doing it more often. Certainly, all of us over the age of 40 need to be lifting heavy weights. That's important. I don't think that yoga and body, holding your own body weight is enough. There's so much research now that lifting weights is so important for bone density and, so many other myriad benefits. So lifting weights is super important, cardiovascular strength and health as well.
And I want to
Um,
please just interject too, having that yoga background. My whole life growing up, my yoga teacher from when I was really young became a very famous leader in the yoga world and was male. And there was always an emphasis in that yoga school of, the flexibility. And I think that's a common thing. So just tying it back to being female, embodied, tying it back to uh, menopause and perimenopause, right? And it's something that I was never as flexible as a lot of the other women. I was pretty flexible, I'm like very flexible compared to the average person, but compared to these different yoga female bodied women in conferences, I wasn't definitely not the most flexible. And sometimes I would get like a little chagrin because I was always doing the planks and I was doing this and I was doing that. And now I'm like, I'm so freaking happy I didn't listen to like any of those male teachers because, like you're saying, as women, as our bodies age, we need that strength extra, right? So
mhm,
I just love
mhm.
how you're highlighting that, and it's just such an intrinsic part of the conversation for listeners who are younger, because I have a lot of younger listeners. I actually was looking at my stats recently, and my partner was like, "Oh my God, look at all the young people listening to you." I was like, "I know, right?" That strength building, especially being female, is so important. So thank you for
Yeah.
highlighting that.
Yeah, it's so important. It's hugely important. So 3 times a week, I think, is at minimum what's recommended, 20 minutes, 3 times a week of weight training.
Yeah.
Um, so whatever kind of physical activity is really inspiring, but doing that, committing to that, I think, we know enough now that up leveling our nutrition and supplements and optimizing blood work, it is kind of a lot to keep track of. I found, just to stay on top of all of those things, but to some degree, taking it on because that has a direct impact. Your physical health has a direct impact on your mental emotional health because it's all related to hormones and neurotransmitters, and the kind of thoughts you're thinking are often determined from the biochemistry that's happening in your body. And I like to say there's 2 ways that we can work, and you want to work both ways in your own healing and evolution. Number one is working from the outside in, which is putting yourself in the state, right? Getting strong, getting clear, getting flexible, again, supplements, nutrition, blood work, so that you're taking care of this physical body and it will work internally to have an optimal effect in the mind and the emotions. But we also want to work from the inside out to be shifting the genetics. And so they, again, it's 2 sides of the same coin. The
Yeah.
other thing that I really want to highlight for people in terms of concrete steps, actionable steps to take, is really detoxing and getting very vigilant about your relationship with technology because we are being so conditioned and we don't even think about it or realize it. And so just even scrolling Instagram I've really had to minimize my scroll, my consumption of social media. And so I noticed that even 15, 20 minutes, all of a sudden I'm thinking very different thoughts. I'm in a very different headspace. I'm in a very different mental, emotional space. And so please stay off of the electronics at least, the first 30 minutes when you're up in the morning. And I would say minimum 1 hour before you go to bed at night. Please don't let it be the last thing you do is like you're scrolling yourself to sleep. It's really dangerous and it's really having a very negative effect for many of us. Now, there's a lot of good that comes out of social media and connectivity, of course, and reaching people like you that I would never reach otherwise if we didn't have these great assets and resources. But we need to understand that every single algorithm, AI didn't just come out 2 years ago with Chat GPT. AI is the Facebook algorithm. It is the Instagram algorithm, Twitter algorithm. And so we know that they're built and engineered to keep us addicted. It's a dopamine hit. And when we understand that, we're being fed this, the conditioned in this false formula. And we really have to pay attention, being very, very mindful about our consumption of technology.
So helpful, so fantastic. And I love that image of a samurai because they have to bend their knees. And part of that training is being really low to the ground. So staying really grounded, right? They train outside. And I was contemplating as you were giving your gems of wisdom of things to hone in on and actionable steps to do, all of them don't require technology, which seems like a blaring flash of the obvious, but so many people grapple with this. So many people struggle with this, going outside. I have a podcast episode I just did as a soul cast recently. I call my solo episode Soul Cast. And it was about syncing up with nature. It's a few ago. And it blew up. And I was like, I almost didn't record it because I felt like it was there were so many simple things, but simple things aren't always easy, like going outside, like feeding yourself well, right? All these, as you said, root chakra, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, first level things, but they are actually what the majority, I think, of people really struggle with and are the things that make all the difference. And then you can build your life upon them once you have them. So that exercise, being physical in your body. I'd love to hear you talk about going back to the perimenopause and menopausal conversation, how you now think about that journey from a spiritual perspective, because I heard you speak for like 2 minutes again on social. I'm really disciplined with social media. I just think it's a blessing of having grown up in a stricter kind of environment that wasn't imposed upon me, but I chose to embrace it. So like my kids and I will talk about it. Like they laugh. Like recently they were like, I was like, oh, there's like a feed on YouTube. They're like, Mom, you like you like I go on YouTube to see my son's uploads. I have a YouTube channel for this podcast as of recent, right? But I never bothered to explore the fact that you can actually like their shorts or whatever they're called, But so many people. So back to what I was saying about you, but I was at the gym and I had a feeling. I always trust my feelings. So in between, ironically, lifting weight sets, I'm remembering this. I turn on, the Instagram to check. I hadn't checked it all day, and you were there talking live, and it was you at this moment in between my weight sets that I was doing. And I was like, it's Ashley. I haven't seen her in so long. And you started talking about your journey and sharing a lot about what you alluded to earlier. And you used a few terms, and I can't remember what they were because I was lifting weights, but about how you were thinking about the archetypes of menopause and about menopause and perimenopause as a spiritual journey. So could you go into
Mm-hmm.
that, please? Because I thought it was very powerful and really spoken of in a way that I hadn't thought of or heard. So
Mm-hmm. Well, traditionally in female spirituality, feminine based spirituality, we have this trinity, like in the yogic, masculine model of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, the beginning, middle, end. And we have in a more Celtic or priestess tradition, the feminine, the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And so many people are familiar with um, that triptych. And the maiden, young, that playfulness, that effervescence, the mother energy, of course, also bleeding, they kind of overlap with the sensuality, sexuality, and the lover. But the mother, of course, that nurturer, provider, and then the crone. And the crone is the wise woman and in her elder years, really holding that gravitas. One of the great teachings that and so when you're going through, so the maiden is essentially until maybe first blood, but then really it's more into the 20s, that maiden energy, and then the midlife is the mother, and then the crone is the last. But one of my teachers, Joan Borisinko, who's an incredible psychologist and
incredible.
yeah, just incredible pioneer of mind body medicine, worked at Harvard. And she came up with a fourth archetype, which fits in between the mother and the crone energy. And she calls this the guardian. And so it's from like 45 to 65, I think, something like that. I'll have to go back and look at her age. But the guardian is where we move out of those deep mothering years, ostensibly, presumably, perhaps our children are nearly grown, or maybe they're in their teenage years. We're out of that deep mothering. I'm not out of that deep mothering yet, but But when you have that freedom and you have more of that space, and now you're not menstruating. And so what happens when we're no longer menstruating and so much energy is not going to, potentially, getting pregnant, being pregnant, having a child, or being with our lovers. And of course, we're still with our lovers later in life, but that energy turns inward. And it's the imagery of, I think of it like recycling, like we're turning all of that power back inside. And so then it begins to rise, and we think about, okay, where do we want to direct this? And so her archetype of the guardian is that we are very powerful activists at this time in life, and we become protectors and, again, disruptors, activists. And I really loved the analogy of thinking about it, because I don't really resonate with being a crone yet. I'm not even 50. And so I don't feel, I'm excited to be a crone, but I don't quite feel like I'm really sitting in that seat of an elder. And yet the wheel has turned, and I can recognize, oh, for example, at the yoga studio, I am an elder in that community. I am one of the oldest teachers in the studio. And I actually love teaching all these 20 and 30-year-olds, because I'm able to, share wisdom that's 20 years down the line. So that feels really good. But I don't quite resonate yet with the crone. And by the way, the crone has been very undermined and minimized, and kind of this archetype that's been twisted into this hag or witch, which is part of the patriarchy, demonizing the power of the feminine, because there's really nothing more powerful on this planet than a wise old woman, because she has seen
Exactly.
and lived it all, and it's living
And
in her
nothing,
bones.
excuse me, but more threatening than a woman who
Yeah,
has time on her hands,
yeah.
power on her hands, and isn't a slave to, the youth obsessed culture, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And what happens in the crone years, and even in the guardian years, is that, and I'm seeing it within myself right now, we just care a lot less about what people think about us. And when you don't give a fuck, then you're willing to push back in a
yeah,
much different way, and you're willing to challenge the status quo. So, yeah, you're right. It's absolutely threatening and sitting in that kind of power. But the guardian, so for me, I kind of, I'm working with it. Like, what is that fourth archetype one? For me, I think the wise woman really resonates, that, or the high priestess, this kind of real empowered, the queen energy, is, those really resonate for me in that fourth, um, period, which is what I'm in, so like, again, maybe 45 to 65 or something like that.
yeah.
So
Oh,
I don't,
beautifully, beautifully articulated.
yeah, I don't know if that was the exact framework that you were thinking of, and I'm happy to go more into it. But it's been a very, and the truth is, I mean, I think it's so ironic that here I am as a yoga teacher, a therapist, like all my friends and colleagues, that's all we do is this deep work, like yourself. And yet here I am, feeling so isolated and feeling the challenges of being a woman in middle age and aging and dealing with gray hair and wrinkles and low sex drive. And I'm like, wow, I'm ashamed and I don't want to talk about it, to a lot of people. So, it's interesting because we moved to the east side of LA. We moved to a totally, essentially, it's like living in a different city. And I've met all new friends. And most of them are my daughters, are friends from our school, from our preschool. And most of them are, at least 5 to 10 years younger than me. And I watched how, this is just an example, I watched how I was resisting telling them that, we're all seeing each other at ballet or soccer, like, hey, how are you doing? And I'm like,
Mhm.
I'm really struggling because I'm going through perimenopause, and it's really been an intense journey for me. And I don't want to tell them because they're younger. And I noticed that the couple of people that I did confide in, if I'm confiding in women that are younger than me, they actually, their general response is they kind of don't want to hear it, because
Yeah,
they're like, oh, you don't look that old. Oh, there's no way you're going through. Oh, like, they actually don't really want to be in that conversation, because it's a
yeah,
harsh reality and reflection to them of like, this is coming too, and it's
It's
right
a
around the corner
trailer
for
for
you.
them of what's coming.
It's a
Totally.
trailer. And I didn't want to deal with, age. So I mean, it's a bigger conversation about aging and ageism.
Yeah. That's what
And
I was going to say. Exactly. Like the whole, even our culture, how we just completely ignore, act like it's not happening, and really, disrespect and at extreme belittle the elder
yeah,
people in our society compared to indigenous cultures who completely honor, celebrate, and elevate
yeah,
their elders,
yeah.
right?
And
So,
and I want to really call out, that I don't really think that there has been much, well, there hasn't been much education around much of women's health. We know the crisis around childbirth and birthing and pregnancy, but also, um, and especially menopause. Menopause has been vastly underfunded, under researched, and it's really only our generation. I mean, maybe the generation before, but really this generation where it's coming full onto the full public scale, celebrities starting companies about it. Like there's this en masse movement of like, wait a second, this has not been properly addressed, because it was only 20 years ago that the Women's Health Initiative came out, which is a huge scientific study around bioidentical hormones, and was completely twisted. And basically, they associated, there was a misinterpretation of a lot of the data associating
yeah,
bioidentical hormones with breast cancer, and so many women went off the hormones and or never went on them. And women have not been, people I should say, have not been treated properly for menopause, and not to mention the amazing side effects, benefits of going on bioidenticals. Of course, that's a decision for everyone to make on their own with their physician,
yeah,
but there's a lot of research that shows the benefit of taking bioidenticals for brain health, and
yeah,
how it's now, being thought that our lack of estrogen and progesterone, but estrogen in particular, really affects our brain health and can lead to the increased rates of dementia and Alzheimer's in women versus men. So it's just that there hasn't been a lot of conversation about it until very recently, in the last 10 years or so. And luckily, finally, it's happening, but we have a lot of catching up to do.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And I love how you're speaking of this new idea of a fourth stage of life, so to speak, because if you think about it, we're just living so much longer, as each
Yeah,
generation does.
exactly.
So, the last, you could argue, two generations in people with economic privilege, we should say
Right.
too, and it begs to mention, are
Yeah.
now, have expanded the lifespan so exponentially, right? So now there is this other phase for many people who are lucky enough to still be alive. And it's very interesting to think about, right, how to handle it spiritually. Because in many of the ancient traditions, whether it's the yogic tradition, whether it's the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, many of those Eastern traditions specifically, there is similar stages, as you're saying, mother, maiden, crone, and the crone time, right? You have the kids, and then they become, teenagers and adults, and then what do? You turn towards your sadhana, you turn towards your spiritual practices. Everything is pulling within, right? Your menses, your psyche, and then you're just like on the path, prescriptively. In many of those different traditions, you don't participate in sex, you literally just turn within, and your whole life becomes, dedicated to spirituality. And that's an amazing path. I know people on that path.
Mhm.
And yet, if you're in our Western culture, if you are a householder like you and I am, right, there's a different calling. There can be a different dharma. And so it's like up to us. And that's part of what's so exciting to me about this conversation. That's what's exciting to me about this podcast, because, so many of us, again, with privilege, who have privilege, are in a position now to really dive deep and almost curate their own spirituality, their own sadhana. And that includes the householder cycles of life, and then what we do with them, what we do with that free will in choosing them. And I love that phase you spoke of. You said the guardian phase, which is so beautiful. I call it my empress phase. I'm going to go into my empress phase. That's what I keep saying. I like that term,
I
empress.
love that. Empress, that's beautiful.
But talk to me about priestess, because I have a Celtic Irish background. And so, there, again, in the spirit of this participatory DJing, almost claiming and deepening one's own spiritual practices that we have such privilege to do, those of us who do, can name ourselves different things. So many of my friends are like, oh, I'm a witch, and they really resonate with that. This is true, deep calling and practices and lifestyles that friends of mine live and people I know live. And so, priestess, I know you call yourself a priestess. I call myself a priestess. I can talk about why, but I'd love to hear why you use that nomenclature, or why that feels authentic and true to you. And in your mind, what is that ultimate priestess path mean to you?
Yeah, I read, when I read the book Mists of Avalon, I read that book in my early 20s, and it completely changed my life. And it's a historical fiction book about the time of the Arthurian legend, King Arthur. And at the time, the matriarchal traditions, in particularly in England, but in Europe, that were running the show, basically. It was more of a feminine based spirituality. And this was the time when the Roman Crusades were coming in and sweeping through Christianity and Judeo Christianity over the whole continent. And the feminine traditions were really pushed into the underground. And that's the metaphor of the mists coming down over Avalon, where the power of the feminine and feminine spirituality necessarily was pushed into the underground and alchemized really in all these different ways, hidden in all these different ways, because it was persecuted. But the story is about the priestesses of Avalon and Morgane Le Fay and many others. But when I read the book, and it's such a beautiful tome, I had never even heard the word priestess. And as soon as I started reading about these priestess temples in Avalon, it was like a homecoming. I felt like, oh my God, I was a priestess in Avalon. And I'm not one of those psychic people that says, oh, I was this or that in a past life, but it really resonated with me to that level. Then I found my teacher shortly after that, Ariel Spilsbury, who runs the 13 Moon Mystery School. And I did a year-long apprenticeship with her, which was phenomenal. That was back in 2007. And that also changed my life. And it was the first time that I had been exposed to very deep, feminine, spiritual practices. And then I went on after that. I started weaving that into all of my yoga and depth psychology, both of which work a lot with archetypes and archetypal psychology. And in the Priestess Mystery School I went to, we studied 13 different faces of the goddess, or 13 different archetypes, which also really resonated. And then my colleague Sienna Sherman and I launched eventually our Urban Priestess Mystery School several years later, weaving in all of these teachings. So for me, the archetype of the priestess is the same archetype of the priest. Now we think of it in, maybe many of the listeners might have an association with the Catholic Church. Let's say the priest archetype is the one who is in direct contact with God or spirit. So the priestess is the same. It just simply means, and by the way, we are all priests and priestesses, that we are channeling, we are connected to, we are vessels, vehicles of spirit. So how do we plug in? How do we connect to spirit and then move as servants of God, if you will, or, a vehicle for consciousness, however you want to frame it. So the priestess tradition are all these different ways, particularly feminine based ways, to align with nature and open ourselves up to have greater capacity and access to consciousness, spiritual, undifferentiated, unified, transcendent consciousness. So for me, the priestess tradition, I largely work with more of the Celtic traditions and feel like I'm really just beginning on that path, but also resonates a lot with me with the yogic tradition and the different priestesses and dakinis and goddesses in the yogic tradition. And so how do we, because we've never been taught in our culture, our conditioning, of course, was very male based, patriarchal based. We've never been taught about the power of feminine Shakti, our feminine energy, our feminine consciousness, which is different than masculine. consciousness. And it's not a gender thing. It's just the different polarities. And so for me, that looks like using the body. It's a very tantric approach, using the body as a doorway, as a vehicle for consciousness, our sensuality, our sexuality, again, nature, connecting with the earth around us, aligning with the wheel of the year, the solstice, the equinox, and the 4 cross-quarter holidays, really celebrating that agrarian calendar as our guiding, our roadmap for living life. And again, because we live in such a solar, masculine conditioned culture, we don't honor the ebb and the flow. I mean, I live in Southern California, so we don't really have a significant winter season here. But to really give ourselves permission to go in and hibernate and take that time to turn inward, that's one example. And then recognize all the different medicine and meaning that comes from each of these different 8 high holy days. So in my membership that I have, it's called the Haven. One of the things that we do along with yoga, meditation, and shadow work is align around, we have a ritual around each of these 8 high holy days so that people can just have built-in rhythms to help us. It's essentially, it's medicine for the psyche, because our psyche needs that ebb and flow, and it helps us make meaning of this and gives us permission, to be at all these different phases instead of just on all the time.
Beautiful. So beautiful. Such a great elucidation of the priestess path and the integrating the elements in that agrarian perspective and lens, so to speak. What are, say, two, 3 micro rituals that our listeners could do that you recommend as a way to get into more rhythm with nature, because you and I are talking about rhythms, and I mentioned that podcast episode I had recently about syncing up with the rhythms of nature, because they really do act like such architecture, within. They create structure, they create consistency, they create that root chakra grounding and tethering that can really put our nervous systems in a great place, put our physiology in a great place, and ritual as well. You're mentioning ritual, so could you maybe just give a little pithy, like, what do you mean by ritual? I've talked about ritual in several episodes, so I want people to hear, okay, what does that mean to you? Is that a dramatization of what's on the inside, outside? Is that a calling in? And then, maybe 2 to 3 little micro rituals they could do to call in more of what you're speaking to in the way of creating
that's
structure.
a great question. I love that question. Well, ritual to me is, I studied depth psychology as a psychotherapist. I went to Pacifica Graduate Institute, and it's very Jungian based, and we have all of Joseph Campbell's library there. And so that's the orientation that I carry as a therapist. And one of the teachings of that tradition is that one of the things that is the most powerful for our psyche is to have that physical representation of something. It helps us to make meaning. It helps us to integrate whatever's happened internally, mentally, emotionally, psychospiritually, to have a physical gesture, some physical practice that we do. So for example, when I'm leading retreats or events, I'll often have my students or, retreat attendees, I'll craft a ritual. For example, we did their maiden and crone ritual, where we had a huge altar to the maiden, a huge altar to the mother, and then to the crone, the wise woman. And so we had all these different tools and, things they could do. And the women would go to wherever they could go to any of the altars, all of them. And they were actually creating a crown. And so there were different flowers and things that they could use on each altar. And so maybe if they had a childhood wound or a core, wound from childhood or trauma, or maybe they had a mother wound, or they have fertility journey and wanting to get pregnant or having a challenge with a child, they would go to the mother altar. Or maybe they were going through menopause, or fear of aging, or anything like that, or they just needed to commune with a wise woman, they would go there. And so what happens when you get out of the thinking mind and out of the even speaking mind, we were nonverbal, you start to work in this non-linear way, and you start to open up and access the right brain. So when you're in ritual space, hopefully you're opening the right brain. The non-linear, the unconscious, subconscious mind starts to come online, especially when you're engaging the body. And that could be from a simple little craft, like we were making a flower crown. That could be from, a mudra, a gesture. Another thing that I like to do in ritual space is literally draw a line and have a real threshold of initiation where someone steps over that line and we do a whole invocation. And then they're saying, okay, I'm letting go of this, whatever it is. I'm no longer going to be this, or I'm no longer going to hold this belief. And then to actually have them, when they're ready, physically step over a line in the sand. When you do it in a ritual way, in a really mindful, activated field, it has a very deep effect on the psyche. And it's much easier to integrate in the psyche when you add a physical, tangible element rather than just talking about it. So for me, that's ritual space, is somehow engaging the body and the spirit and using, as you said, the elements in a creative way. And there's no right way to do ritual. The right way to do ritual is however you feel it, whatever's coming through you. That's the great thing about feminine, consciousness and spirituality, is like you don't need a manual. You don't need to go to a class or take an online course or get a diploma. You instead turn inward and trust your own intuition and then show up. So I have done rituals, in a conference center in Hong Kong when I was teaching at a conference, or, at a school, and my assistants always laugh because I'll always say, oh, let's go source some tools for our ritual. And they're like, oh my God, you're so funny, source. And I'm just going around and I'll just walk around the conference center and I'll be like, oh, let's just borrow these plastic flowers for a little bit and let's gather this blanket over here. And then the next thing I know, I've like created a ritual in the middle of a conference room. So there's no right way to do it. But in a nutshell, a little bit of a formula is like, getting clear, taking a moment to ground, get neutral, cast a circle or just activate the circle in whatever way. I like to call in the directions and say a big invocation and prayer, dedicate the ritual to whatever you want, whatever the intention is. Maybe call in a song or something, then do whatever the piece of work is. Could be writing, could be burning something in the fire, could be just going around and sharing something, could be something more elaborate. And then closing it, so you have that natural arc and you're doing the piece of work in the middle and then you close it at the end. And at the end, you always offer the benefit, of whatever's happened to all beings. May this be beneficial to all beings. That's a more elaborate kind of like, let's do a ritual around something. I like to ritualize every day. So quick example is I get up every morning. I like to get up about an hour before my partner and my baby. And so I like to sage the whole house, and then I go around and often do sweetgrass. And then I pick my essential oils that I'm feeling for the day and start that blend. And so everything is grounded. I've connected to the elements. I feel much more grounded and awake when I've done just that simple thing. And, maybe you add a prayer and you're just saying a prayer of protection or asking for, easeful day or, gratitude that you're alive that day. So I always start my day. If I don't start my day that way, I feel really discombobulated and ungrounded. And then there's a few other practices physically that I'll do, but just the simple act of saging, or maybe it's lighting a candle and putting on some, gentle music, or again, essential oils, or even anointing yourself with essential oil, whatever it is that's going to help you feel like I am here now. I'm in present space and time. The other thing about ritual is it moves us out of, as I said, thinking mind. And so it's an opportunity to activate and pull online a more whole brain consciousness, whole body, consciousness. So like all of me is here. I'm not just leading my life from this prefrontal cortex.
Yes.
So that's a simple one,
So good. So I love how you're pulling
yeah.
your senses. You're talking about your senses too, and just drawing in, essential oils or sage. And so people listening can think about, am I more tactile? Of my five senses,
Yeah.
which senses help me, as you say, ground, anchor, and tether? Because in the morning, as you mentioned, and I talk about it in a lot of ways on this podcast, the importance of that morning AM time, because our vibration is higher, meaning wider, more open, because as Ashley mentioned, when we're sleeping, we are in that more right brain unconscious land already. So when we awaken, we can tease that out more by doing ritual. We don't just jump right into that left brain, do, go, go, go. But if we take
Right.
that moment to remember where we just came from, tease that out, make a sweeter, more slow roll of that out by doing ritual, then
Yeah.
as that brilliant word integration happens. And when you get into the doership space, because we all have to do and be and do all the things and be who we are in this world, we're doing it from a place of integration, of balance, right and left hemispheres, of masculine, feminine, any way you want to think about it. So that was so great. Thank you so much. I love that. And so people can think
Yeah,
about
I
their
think I think in a
senses.
nutshell, it's just bringing intention,
Yeah.
bringing intention and doing things really mindfully and connecting to the sacred, whatever that is for you. There
Yeah.
is this thread of life that is holy and sacred. And how do we reconnect to that as much as possible throughout our day,
Yes.
and just remember that and weave that reality into every moment. And it helps us
Yes.
to make meaning and feel that sense of belonging as well.
Yes, yes, because of, as you said, that intention being really clear with your attention. So I love those two words, and I feel them when you're speaking a lot. It's having clear intention and then practicing attention too. So people can really take those two words as party favors and think about that in any moment. Okay, what is my intention behind any moment in time, in this moment in space? Because often when our nervous systems are dysregulated, we're not in touch with our intention, and then we're not in touch with our attention. Where is my attention? Oh, it's somewhere else. Let me bring my attention back to my intention. So I love all the things you said, but that idea. And lastly, because I promised the listeners as we start to close, how about bringing more of this into parenting and caregiving and even our businesses? Because that's a passion of yours, I know, and you do it so skillfully. So, can you just talk a little bit about this as we start to wind down?
Yeah, I'm going through as I mentioned, I'm going through a big shift in my business, and I just so happen to be looking for a new team member, really my right hand in my business I really wanted to streamline. I kind of built a big team, and now I just want to get back to, this is an example. Yes, I have to go through all the things like job description and posting it and, interviews and all applications and all of that. But what I've really been doing is sitting in very deep prayer and calling in, like, who is, and visualizing, like, who is really the right person for this role? What am I really calling in? Much like you might call in, your soulmate or your partner.
I was just thinking
But
that. It sounds like that. I love it.
yeah, but really think about, like, and allowing myself to dream bigger, allowing myself to say, no, actually, what would be your ideal person? Who is that person? And they love yoga and they love this, but they're super good with systems and, technology. So, but even stretching myself to dream bigger. But the
Well,
point of that is, like, really trusting that some of the spiritual energetic work and alignment is just as important as the logistical, um, tactile action.
yes.
So that's one way to lead. And, also really listening to your intuition. And again, these are soft skills. Like, this is not something that's tangible on, a leadership board of 1 to 10, but I believe that these qualities are maybe even more important in how we lead in our business, especially as conscious women, to really take the time to try. And that's what I mean when I said I really had to start meditating, because I haven't been clear about the next step. And part of it is giving myself permission to be in that chrysalis phase, even
Yeah.
though the phase is much longer than I would have hoped. It's going on 2 years. And I'm still not quite clear, but it's becoming clear. And certain things have transpired. We launched the membership, which is amazing, but really the next iteration of my work, and trusting my intuition. So one of the things is I've been working a lot more with psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy, and it's been a huge part of my path for 25 years. And I've led several shamanic pilgrimages down to Peru, shamanic
Mm.
yoga pilgrimages, working with ayahuasca. And now I'm really wanting to double down on bringing that forward in small group retreats and small group work and one-on-one work. And it's taken a while to kind of formulate, like, what does it want to look like for me? And of course it will change, but giving myself permission to just be in the unknown. And I think that's
Yes.
really important, because we have all of these models and frameworks and books and courses that we're told it should look like this, but there is no one right way. That itself is a pillar of white supremacy culture. There's one right way. And if you're not following this right way, you're doing it wrong. And then that creates shame because, oh, I'm not doing it right. And power over, because someone's holding the power of how it should be done. And all of that is a false belief, and it's
Yes.
complete invention. And so when we really trust ourselves and our own intuition, we realize there's a million, whereas as many people on the planet, versions of how this can be done, and so it's really doubling down on me, that back to that self-trust and trusting myself in my own business dealings. Of course, being strategic and wise, but placing more emphasis on my own intuition and what feels aligned in my own body mind than in what some strategist is telling me.
Really powerful, and really flipping it on its head. And I think it comes back to, I know for me at least, running my business and my professional life first from the place of connecting to source. So it's almost like
Yeah.
full circle
Yeah.
this conversation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, instead of go, 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 do, it's no, let me pause, let me feel, let me breathe, let me connect to source, my highest self, however you want to think about it. And then now I'll go be, but I'm plugged in. Everyone's so worried about their charger and their phone and is this charged, right? And it's like, no, let me charge and then let all that, electricity come out and all the doing happen. So that's so wise
Totally.
how you spoke of it, and so
Yeah.
inspiring. And my best friend and I have this mantra we always throw and remind each other back and forth, which is, your pace is perfect, which I think feminine, it's so that, right? Like, your pace is perfect. Like, when one of us goes through it, like, a dark night of the soul, and we feel like we should know more answers or be doing different things, right? So your pace is perfect. And then I always say to my kids who are older than yours, when people talk about, like, are you in the box, outside the box? And I always say, guess what? I'm going to let you in on a secret. There's no box. There's no fucking box. There's no box. So like you
Yeah.
said, right, opening up to all
Yeah.
the choices and opening to the idea that truly your path is 1,000% unique and you're here to make it that way.
Yeah. And it's
So,
the same. It's the same with parenting. It's just really trusting that intuition and really taking the time. I think the biggest thing that I've been learning in parenting is patience. I'm an
mm,
extremely impatient person, and I've been really reflecting on how much my daughter, just teaches me patience to slow down, whether it's just taking 5 minutes to get out of the car, or just, but instead flipping that to, like, wow, look at all this magic right here. Like, she's so magical and she's so lit up, and what a teaching. Um,
yes.
so then finding ways to really tune her into spirit and tune her into, um, ritual and mindfulness and embodiment, and helping her just foster that self trust and her own intuition, which is great.
Amazing. Well, and just by being who you are, right? Don't you think the example as a parent, her watching you do the things you do, is perhaps the biggest gift you could give her? Do you concur with that?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Definitely. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, Ashley, would you be willing to close it out with a 30-second minute benediction or prayer or mindfulness
Definitely,
exercise, whatever you feel
definitely.
moved?
Sure. Thank you so much. So why don't you all just come to a comfortable seated position? You can close the eyes if that feels good. Otherwise, just gazing down towards the tip of the nose. And let's take 3 deep breaths, inhaling from the base all the way up to the crown. And then from the crown, pouring the breath all the way down and out to the base, like a French press, just pushing that prana energy down and out. And 2 more inhale, like an inner volcano, let it rise all the way up, up through the center line, all the way up to the crown. Slight pause. Exhale from the crown, pouring all the way down and out. Again, any tension, pressure, anxiety. And then one more time, inhaling from the base. Let it rise, fresh, clear prana, inspiration, energy, healing, reversing flow. Feeling that central channel, rooting down, subterranean, below the earth, all the way down into the center of the earth. And then feel the crown rise, lengthening all the way up to the sky and beyond the sky, all the way up into the heart of the universe. So you're deeply plugged into the center of the earth, connected, grounded, sourced. And then you're deeply expanded all the way up beyond the beyond into the heart of the universe, connecting to source energy as above, so below. And feeling the central channel as the vehicle for your consciousness. And then let's take 3 deep breaths at the third eye center, activating your intuition, your sight, your visionary capabilities to begin to see what is most aligned, what is most true for you. So not trying, just breathing in and out from the center of the third eye, right between the eyebrows, just above the eyebrows, and draw straight back into the center of the brain, into the center of the skull, center of the head here. Maybe you see an orb or a glowing light or a flame or a color in the center of your head, midbrain. And then breathing into the space for 3 times, inhaling, softening into that expanded space as you exhale. 2 more, inhaling to the center of the midbrain, softening there. And then 1 more, placing the attention at the heart. Last 3 breaths here, right into the center of the heart. Inhale, opening up your capacity, remembering who you really are. Spirit, open-hearted, soften on the exhale. And again, as you inhale, fill the back of the lungs between the shoulder blades, expanding completely. And then placing 1 hand on the heart, the other hand on top. Connect to what is literally on your heart. What is your deepest yearning for today? Desire? Where is life calling you to rise up? You to stretch and lean into your edges, becoming a little more skillful, a little more mindful, intentional, a little more conscious. Consider 1 quality, the most useful quality that you could cultivate today. Maybe it's courage, forgiveness, discipline, joy. Just 1 word, whatever comes to your mind first. And a breath into that. And opening the mouth, exhale. And we close giving thanks, gratitude for this breath, for this moment, for this beautiful gift of life. So fleeting, so fragile, so magical, so beyond comprehension. And we ask that any insight, anything shared, anything helpful ripples out to be in service to the good of all beings, to you, to your loved ones, to your work in the world. Aho, thank you, namaste, and so it is. Blessings.
It's just so
Thank you.
luscious, so deep, and so wide. Thank you so, so much. It's going to be hard for me to come back to, but I will muster.
Yeah.
Ashley, well, I come back to, why don't you tell folks how to find you and, where they can really learn
Yeah,
more and
thank
more
you all
about your
so
amazing work.
much. I have a monthly membership. It's called the Haven Yoga Meditation app and a holistic mental health platform, also aligning around the rituals, the Wheel of the Year. And so you can go to my Instagram. It's probably the best place. Instagram is Ashley Turner 1. Ashley Turner, ASHLEY Turner, and the number 1. I also work with small groups of women and high performing women, and just looking to really align with their soul's evolution and build their life from that place of deep empowerment and alignment, everything we've been talking about today. So that could be a group coaching or personal coaching and psychedelic assisted therapy as well, women's empowerment retreats, shadow work retreats as well. So yeah, connect on Instagram, DM me, and then we'll get connected there. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Well, and Ashley is so generously offering my monthly members 108 journal prompts to rinse, release, and heal difficult emotions. And Ashley is the literal forerunner in my mind of people integrating deep spirituality and modern Western psychology. So that sounds amazing. And Ashley, thank you so much for offering that to our members. I also have a new free building intuition toolkit. So for friends who are listening and want to go deeper in truly this path of cultivating their divine feminine prowess, they can go to modernmystic.love/intuition. Ashley, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your truly deep and profound work in this world that for really decades now is leaving a mark, I think, on American spirituality. So thank you for all of your personal, internal, and external work.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to speak with you. Such a rich conversation. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Definitely reach out. Keep in touch.
Here's everyone to living a more meaningful, mindful, and magical life. Namaste.